There's a name from ancient history that doesn't get mentioned nearly enough, yet it should send a chill down your spine. Picture an empire so ruthlessly efficient, so calculated in its cruelty, that entire cities would surrender without a fight just to avoid its wrath. This wasn't Rome, this wasn't Egypt, this was the Assyrian Empire, a civilization that mastered the art of war and terror like no one before or since. While other ancient powers built monuments to their gods or their glory, the Assyrians built something far more enduring, a reputation for absolute, bone-chilling dominance. What made them so terrifying? It wasn't just their weapons, though those were brutally advanced for their time. It wasn't just their armies, though they moved with a precision that would make modern generals take notes. It was their mastery of fear itself. The Assyrians didn't just conquer, they broke their enemy's will long before the first arrow was loosed. They turned psychological warfare into an art form, using tactics so shocking that even today, they're hard to comprehend. Imagine walls lined with the skins of rebellious leaders. Imagine entire populations uprooted and scattered across the empire, stripped of their identity, their history, even their hope. This wasn't just conquest, it was annihilation of the spirit. And yet, for all their infamy, the Assyrians remain one of history's most overlooked empires. Maybe it's because their reign was so brutal that later civilizations tried to erase them from memory. Maybe it's because their stories are buried under the dust of time, waiting to be uncovered. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on this shadowy superpower. We'll explore how they built an unstoppable war machine, how they ruled through terror, and why their legacy still echoes in the tactics of modern warfare. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the Assyrians weren't just another ancient empire. They were the blueprint for how to terrify the world into submission. So buckle up, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a journey into the mind of an empire that thrived on fear and changed the course of history forever. The story of the Assyrian Empire begins not with thunderous conquests, but with quiet survival. Nestled along the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, their earliest settlements were modest, vulnerable to raids from neighboring tribes and the whims of nature. But something set them apart, a relentless drive to turn weakness into strength. While other kingdoms relied on fertile land or trade routes, the Assyrians cultivated something far more potent, an unshakable will to dominate. Their first kings weren't just rulers, they were architects of destiny, laying stone by stone the foundation of an empire that would one day shake the world. What made their rise so extraordinary wasn't just speed, it was strategy. While rivals like Babylon or Egypt relied on tradition, the Assyrians embraced innovation. They didn't wait for enemies to attack, they struck first, dismantling threats before they could grow. Early records tell of kings like Tiglath-Pileser I, who didn't just defend his borders but pushed them outward, campaign after campaign, until Assyria's shadow stretched across the horizon. But here's the twist, their greatest weapon wasn't brute force, it was organization. While other armies were loose bands of warriors, the Assyrians built the world's first professional war machine, soldiers trained not just to fight, but to march, siege, and conquer with clockwork precision. And then there were the chariots, light, fast, and deadly. They became the empire's signature, allowing Assyrian forces to outmaneuver opponents who still lumbered into battle on foot. Pair that with iron weapons harder, sharper, and more abundant than the bronze tools of their rivals, and you start to see why resistance crumbled before them. But perhaps their most terrifying advantage, adaptability. When faced with a walled city, they didn't just starve it out, they built siege towers taller than the walls themselves. When rebels hid in mountains, they didn't give chase, they burned the forests that sheltered them. Every challenge had an answer, every enemy a tailored nightmare. Yet for all their military genius, the true secret to Assyria's rise lay in their mindset. They didn't see war as a last resort. It was their way of life, woven into the fabric of their culture. From childhood, boys were taught that strength was virtue, mercy was weakness, and conquest was destiny. This wasn't just an empire built on land or gold. It was built on an idea that fear, wielded correctly, could be more powerful than any army. And as we'll soon see, that idea would reshape the ancient world in ways no one could escape. The Assyrian war machine wasn't just advanced for its time, it was centuries ahead of its rivals, a brutal symphony of innovation and intimidation. Picture an army that didn't just rely on brute strength, but on engineering, logistics, and a chilling understanding of human psychology. Their siege towers, for example, weren't just crude ladders, they were multi-story monstrosities, wheeled right up to city walls, allowing archers to rain death from above while sappers mined below. And when those walls finally fell, the Assyrians didn't stop at victory. They made sure everyone saw the consequences. Rebellious leaders skinned alive, their hides nailed to the gates as a warning. Defiant cities, entire populations uprooted, marched across the empire, and resettled in distant lands where their identity would dissolve into nothing. But what truly set them apart was their mastery of iron. While others still clung to softer bronze, Assyrian smiths forged weapons that could slash through armor like cloth. Their soldiers carried not just swords but standardized gear, helmets, shields, even boots, issued by a centralized war machine that functioned more like a modern army than an ancient one. And then there were the cavalry units, a terrifying innovation. Mounted archers could strike and vanish before opponents even raised their shields, while lancers charged with a precision that turned chaos into calculated slaughter. Yet the real genius of the Assyrians wasn't in their weapons or tactics, it was in their understanding of fear as a weapon. Before a single arrow was fired, they'd send envoys to neighboring kingdoms, describing in graphic detail what happened to those who resisted. Survivors of their campaigns were deliberately allowed to flee, spreading horror stories like a plague. They didn't just want to conquer land, they wanted to paralyze the will to fight. And it worked. Records show cities surrendering without resistance, their leaders begging for mercy at the mere rumor of an approaching Assyrian army. This wasn't just warfare, it was theater, a spectacle of cruelty designed to echo across generations. Even their propaganda was meticulous, palace walls carved with images of kings standing atop mountains of severed heads, inscriptions boasting of rivers turned red with enemy blood. They didn't just record history, they weaponized it, ensuring their reputation outran their actual reach. And in the end, that reputation became their most enduring conquest, a shadow that stretched far beyond the battlefield, whispering one unshakable truth: resistance was worse than futile. It was suicide. Psychological warfare wasn't just a tactic for the Assyrians, it was their entire playbook, written in blood and carved in stone. Take King Asshurbanipal II, whose royal inscriptions read like horror stories. He didn't just record victories, he reveled in the gruesome details, describing how rebels were skinned alive, their flesh draped over city walls like macabre banners. Prisoners were impaled on stakes, their bodies left to rot in the sun as a warning to anyone daring to defy Assyrian rule. But here's the chilling truth: these weren't acts of blind rage. Every mutilation, every public display of suffering was calculated. The Assyrians understood something revolutionary: that fear could travel faster than any army, bending enemies to their will before a single sword was drawn. Their propaganda was just as deliberate. Walk through the ruins of an Assyrian palace, and you'd find walls covered not just with scenes of battle, but with meticulously crafted nightmares. Artists depicted sieges where enemies were trampled under chariots, their leaders groveling at the feet of Assyrian kings. Inscriptions boasted of cities reduced to ash, their rivers choked with corpses. These weren't just decorations, they were psychological weapons designed to be seen by foreign ambassadors, traders, and even their own people. The message was clear: defiance meant annihilation, and mercy was a myth reserved for those who knelt without resistance. What's truly unsettling is how effective this strategy was. Historical records from neighboring kingdoms mention Assyria's reputation like a creeping shadow. Armies would disband at the rumor of their approach. City gates would swing open without a fight, rulers offering tribute and pledges of loyalty just to avoid the horrors they'd heard about. The Assyrians didn't just conquer land, they conquered minds, turning their enemies' imaginations against them. Even their own subjects lived in a state of controlled terror, knowing rebellion would bring consequences too grotesque to risk. This wasn't just brutality for brutality's sake. It was a cold, efficient system of control, one that allowed a relatively small empire to dominate the ancient Near East for centuries. The Assyrians proved something timeless: that fear, when weaponized, can be more powerful than any army. And as we'll see, their legacy of psychological warfare didn't vanish with their empire. It echoes through history, a dark blueprint for how to rule not just through force, but through the unshakable dread of what might happen if you dare to resist. The Siege of Lachish stands as one of history's most harrowing displays of psychological warfare, a masterclass in terror orchestrated by the Assyrians. In 701 BC, King Sennacherib turned this Judean city into a grim stage for a message meant to echo far beyond its walls. The Assyrians didn't just defeat Lachish, they documented their brutality in painstaking detail, carving reliefs that still survive today. These carvings show prisoners forced to kneel as their skin is peeled from their bodies, families dragged away in chains, and towers collapsing under a rain of flaming arrows. But what's most unsettling isn't the violence itself, it's the precision with which it was staged. Every act was calculated. The Assyrians didn't hide their atrocities, they broadcast them. The reliefs weren't hidden in some dark corner of a palace, they lined the halls of Nineveh, where foreign diplomats and conquered rulers would see them. Sennacherib didn't just want Lachish destroyed, he wanted its fate to become legend. Survivors were deliberately spared, sent fleeing to neighboring cities with tales of what happened to those who defied Assyria. The result: panic spread faster than any army could march. Towns surrendered without resistance, their leaders offering tribute and pledges of loyalty at the mere whisper of approaching Assyrian forces. Yet the real genius of Lachish wasn't in the bloodshed, it was in the spectacle. The siege wasn't a chaotic massacre, it was a meticulously choreographed performance. Engineers built ramps to breach the walls, archers provided covering fire, and infantry advanced in lockstep. Even the prisoners' executions followed a script designed to maximize horror. This wasn't war as the ancient world knew it. It was theater, with Sennacherib as the director and Lachish as the prop, and the audience, every kingdom within earshot, now forced to weigh defiance against the certainty of annihilation. What makes Lachish so haunting isn't just the scale of the violence, but the cold efficiency behind it. The Assyrians didn't revel in cruelty for its own sake. They wielded it like a scalpel, dissecting the will to resist. The reliefs, the survivors, the burned ruins, all were tools in a campaign to conquer minds as much as land. And it worked. For generations after, the mere mention of Assyria could send rulers into panicked submission. Lachish wasn't just a victory, it was a warning etched into history, proof that fear could be more powerful than any army. Mass deportations were the Assyrians' most insidious weapon, not just against bodies, but against memory itself. Imagine entire cities emptied overnight, families torn from ancestral lands, and communities scattered like seeds across the winds of empire. This wasn't chaotic displacement. It was a cold, bureaucratic process recorded in chilling detail. One Assyrian inscription boasts of moving 450,000 people from rebellious regions, mixing them with strangers in distant territories where shared language and history dissolved like salt in water. The goal wasn't just to punish, it was to reprogram. Take the Israelites of Samaria, uprooted after their failed revolt in 722 BC. The Assyrians didn't slaughter them en masse. Instead, they shipped them east to Media and Babylon, replacing them with captives from 5 other conquered nations. Suddenly, neighbors who'd shared generations of traditions found themselves surrounded by strangers speaking unfamiliar tongues, worshipping foreign gods. Within a generation, collective identity unraveled. Songs, stories, even dialects faded into silence. Rebellions require unity, and the Assyrians systematically erased the very soil where unity could grow. What's eerily modern is how they documented these operations. Clay tablets list deportees like inventory. 600 families from Damascus resettled in Nineveh. 300 skilled metalworkers from Tyre relocated to Ashur. This wasn't the randomness of war, it was social engineering at scale. By scattering artisans, they broke guilds. By separating priests from temples, they severed spiritual ties. Even agriculture was weaponized. Farmers from fertile valleys were sent to arid frontiers where their knowledge meant nothing. Yet the true horror lay in the aftermath. Archaeology shows vanished cultures, leaving only faint traces, a potsherd with unfamiliar designs here, a burial custom there. Unlike massacres that inspire martyrs, these deportations left no graves to mourn, only hollowed-out identities. The message to surviving kingdoms was clear: resist, and your people won't just die, they'll cease to be. This strategy's effectiveness echoes through history. Empires from Babylon to Rome would adopt variations of it, but none refined it with such precision. The Assyrians proved that conquest isn't just about controlling land, it's about rewriting the stories people tell themselves, and in that dark art they remain unmatched. The Assyrian thirst for power wasn't just written in blood, it was etched into clay. In the shadow of their terror, they built one of history's most astonishing treasures, the Library of Ashurbanipal. This wasn't some dusty archive. It was a sprawling fortress of knowledge, housing over 30,000 clay tablets covering everything from epic poetry to advanced medicine. Picture a room where the Epic of Gilgamesh lay just shelves away from star charts, where recipes for healing poultices neighbored detailed omens predicting the fates of kings. But here's the twist: this wasn't a sanctuary of pure scholarship. Every scroll, every incantation was a weapon in the hands of an empire that understood knowledge wasn't just power, it was control. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, was no gentle philosopher. He was a conqueror who boasted of flaying rebels alive, yet he also sent scribes across his empire to collect every text they could find. Why? Because he knew secrets could secure an empire as surely as swords. Take the Omen tablets, for example. These weren't just superstitious curiosities, they were tools of statecraft. Priests would read the future in animal entrails or celestial movements, and their interpretations could justify wars, suppress revolts, or legitimize a king's divine right to rule. Knowledge wasn't shared, it was hoarded, curated, and deployed to keep both enemies and subjects in line. Even their scientific advances served the machinery of domination. Medical texts detailing how to treat battlefield wounds weren't just about healing, they ensured soldiers could return to the front faster. Astronomical records didn't merely track stars, they dictated the optimal times for military campaigns. And the library's famed legal codes, they weren't about justice. They were blueprints for extracting taxes, punishing dissent, and maintaining order. Yet amidst this calculated pragmatism, glimmers of something unexpected shine through. The Assyrians preserved Babylonian myths, Sumerian hymns, even foreign treaties. In copying these works, they became accidental guardians of cultures they'd otherwise erased. It's a haunting paradox. The same hands that burned cities also saved humanity's earliest stories from oblivion. This duality is what makes the Assyrians so unnervingly modern. They remind us that enlightenment and brutality aren't opposites, they're tools in the same kit. Ashurbanipal's library wasn't a contradiction to his cruelty, it was its counterpart. Because the ultimate terror isn't just force, it's knowing your oppressor understands the world, and you, better than you do yourself. The mighty Assyrian Empire, which had terrorized the ancient world for centuries, met its end not with a whimper but with a cataclysm of fire and vengeance. In 612 BC, the unthinkable happened. Nineveh, the glittering capital of the empire, fell to a coalition of enemies who had suffered under Assyrian cruelty for generations. The Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians, united by their shared hatred, descended upon the city like a storm. They didn't just conquer Nineveh, they erased it. The siege was brutal, the streets ran red, and when the dust settled, the once proud metropolis was reduced to smoldering ruins. The Assyrians, who had mastered the art of fear, now faced the terror they had once inflicted on others. What's haunting about Nineveh's fall is how completely it vanished. The city was so thoroughly destroyed that its very location was forgotten for centuries, buried under layers of dirt and legend. Even the great Library of Ashurbanipal, with its priceless trove of knowledge, was lost to time until archaeologists stumbled upon its remains in the 19th century. The irony is impossible to ignore. An empire that had meticulously documented its conquests and atrocities left behind only fragments of its own demise. The same carvings that once boasted of Assyrian invincibility now stand as silent witnesses to their downfall. But why did it happen? How could an empire so ruthless, so organized, collapse so spectacularly? The answer lies in the very tactics that built it. The Assyrians ruled through terror, but fear has a shelf life. The more they crushed rebellions with brutality, the more enemies they created. The mass deportations that weakened conquered peoples also sowed seeds of resentment that would one day sprout into revolt. Even their own subjects, living under constant surveillance and punishment, had no loyalty left to give when the end came. The empire had expanded too far, too fast, with no foundation but force. When the coalition armies breached Nineveh's walls, they didn't just destroy a city, they dismantled a legacy. The Babylonians, who would rise to power next, took pains to erase Assyria from history, melting their statues and overwriting their inscriptions. It was as if the world breathed a sigh of relief, eager to forget the nightmare that had gripped it for so long. And yet, the Assyrians left an indelible mark. Their innovations in warfare, administration, and psychological control would echo through every empire that followed. The lesson was clear: you can rule through fear, but unless you give people a reason to stay loyal, even the mightiest throne is built on sand. In the end, Nineveh's fate became the ultimate Assyrian lesson, not in conquest but in consequence. The empire that had mastered the art of making others afraid finally learned what it meant to be on the receiving end. And history, with its quiet irony, ensured that their story wouldn't be one of endless triumph, but of hubris, downfall, and the inevitable truth that no empire, no matter how terrifying, lasts forever. While the Assyrians are remembered for their ruthless military campaigns, their true genius might actually lie in what they built rather than what they destroyed. Take their water systems centuries before Rome's famous aqueducts. Assyrian engineers designed intricate networks of canals and pipelines that could supply water to entire cities, even during sieges. One of their most staggering achievements was the aqueduct at Jerwan, constructed under King Sennacherib in 690 BCE. This wasn't just a simple stone channel. It was a gravity-defying masterpiece, stretching over 900 feet long and supported by towering arches. The precision was astonishing. Engineers calculated slopes down to the slightest degree, ensuring water flowed seamlessly from mountain springs straight into Nineveh's reservoirs. But water was just the beginning. The Assyrians reshaped landscapes to fit their ambitions. When Sennacherib wanted to expand Nineveh into a metropolis worthy of his empire, he didn't just build up, he literally moved mountains. Workers carved entire hillsides into giant terraces to create space for his sprawling palaces, while teams of laborers diverted rivers to feed lush royal gardens. These weren't just displays of wealth, they were logistical feats, proving that the empire could marshal resources and manpower on a scale the ancient world had never seen. Their architectural innovations were equally groundbreaking. Assyrian palaces weren't mere shelters, they were psychological weapons, towering gateways guarded by colossal winged bulls called Lamash, who sent a clear message: step inside, and you're in the realm of unstoppable power. Inside, halls stretched longer than football fields, their walls lined with vivid reliefs depicting military triumphs. Even the floors were engineered for intimidation, embedded with hollow tiles that amplified the footsteps of approaching officials, making every visitor feel the weight of the empire's presence. Yet perhaps their most enduring legacy was urban planning. Assyrian cities like Nimrud and Dur-Sharukin were laid out with geometric precision, featuring wide processional streets, zoning for craftsmen, and even early sewage systems. Fortifications weren't just thick walls, they were layered defenses with strategically placed towers, allowing archers to rain down fire from multiple angles. This wasn't haphazard construction, it was the ancient equivalent of a modern military base, designed to sustain both daily life and prolonged warfare. What's remarkable is how these engineering marvels served dual purposes. Aqueducts kept cities hydrated, but also made sieges harder for enemies. Palaces awed foreign dignitaries while functioning as administrative hubs to manage far-flung territories. Even their roads, paved with stone and meticulously maintained, allowed armies to march at unprecedented speeds. Some stretches were so well built that later empires, including the Romans, would follow their routes. The Assyrians understood something timeless. Infrastructure isn't just about convenience, it's about control. And in that, they were centuries ahead of their time. Standing over 6 feet tall in the British Museum today, the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III isn't just an artifact, it's a time capsule of psychological warfare. Carved from gleaming black limestone, its 4 sides tell a story without words, each panel meticulously crafted to hammer home one unshakable truth: resistance against Assyria wasn't just futile, it was suicidal. At first glance, the scenes seem typical of ancient art: kings receiving tribute, battles won, enemies subdued. But look closer, and you'll see the genius of Assyrian propaganda. Take the depiction of King Jehu of Israel, shown prostrating himself at Shalmaneser's feet, his forehead pressed to the ground in absolute submission. His hands clutch a chest of gold, while Assyrian attendants loom above him like predators over prey. But here's what makes this image so chilling: it wasn't carved for Assyrians. It was meant for foreign eyes. The obelisk stood in Nimrod's central square, where diplomats from vassal states would pass it daily, absorbing its message, "This could be you." The artistry was deliberate too. Jehu isn't just bowing, his spine curves unnaturally, his posture exaggerated to emphasize helplessness. Even the materials whispered power: black limestone, rare and difficult to carve, a visual metaphor for Assyria's unbreakable will. What's fascinating is how the obelisk blends truth with theater. While Jehu did pay tribute, historians debate whether he actually knelt in person or if the scene was embellished for effect. The obelisk's inscriptions don't just list conquests, they revel in specifics. "I received silver, gold, tin, ivory, and embroidered robes from the king of Tyre." These weren't mere records, they were receipts, proof that even the wealthiest kingdoms emptied their treasuries to appease Assyria. Yet the most telling detail might be what's missing. Nowhere does the obelisk show actual combat. There are no chaotic battle scenes, no wounded soldiers, just the aftermath, the inevitable submission. That omission was strategic. The Assyrians understood that showing the cost of defiance, the groveling, the humiliation, was far more potent than showing the fight itself. Why depict struggle when you can showcase the certainty of defeat? This stone monument outlived the empire that created it, surviving fires, looters, and millennia buried in ruins, and in a way, it still serves its original purpose. Today, when visitors crowd around it in museums, they're not just looking at history, they're experiencing the same calculated awe Shalmaneser intended. The obelisk whispers across 28 centuries, "This is what happens when you dare to resist," and somehow, even now, the message lands. To understand the Assyrian Empire is to understand their gods, not as distant deities, but as mirrors of their own relentless ambition. At the heart of their pantheon stood Ashur, not just a god of war, but the embodiment of Assyria itself. Unlike other ancient cultures who worshipped gods of harvest or wisdom, the Assyrians elevated divine figures who personified conquest and absolute dominance. Temples weren't merely places of worship, they were war rooms where priests interpreted omens to guide military campaigns, where kings received blessings not for peace, but for the next bloody campaign. The connection between faith and conquest was no accident. Assyrian inscriptions repeatedly describe kings as the chosen of Ashur, their battles framed not as political maneuvers, but as holy missions. When Tiglath-Pileser III marched into Phoenicia, he didn't claim to be expanding territory. He declared he was extending the boundaries of Ashur's domain. Even their battle standards bore divine symbols, carried before armies like sacred torches lighting the path to victory. This wasn't just symbolism, it was psychological fuel. Soldiers didn't fight for gold or land alone. They fought believing their swords were extensions of divine will, but their religion had a darker edge. Alongside Ashur stood Ishtar, goddess of love and war, a paradox that perfectly captured Assyrian duality. Her temples doubled as arsenals, her priestesses chanting hymns that mixed blessings with battle cries. Then there was Nergal, god of plague and the underworld, whose presence in rituals reminded enemies that resistance meant not just death, but eternal suffering. The message was clear: Assyria's gods didn't offer salvation, they demanded submission. Perhaps most telling was how their rituals blurred the line between worship and warfare. Before major campaigns, kings would perform the sacred hunt, slaughtering lions in staged ceremonies meant to mimic battlefield dominance. Captured enemies were sometimes forced to kneel before statues of Ashur, their humiliation staged as religious theater. Even their architecture reinforced this fusion. Ziggurats weren't just stairways to heaven. Their towering heights doubled as watchtowers overlooking conquered cities. This divine justification reached its peak with the concept of the king as priest. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs who became gods, Assyrian rulers positioned themselves as intermediaries, their every decision framed as divine mandate. Rebellion wasn't just treason, it was heresy punishable by horrors meant to echo eternal damnation. When Sennacherib burned Babylon, he didn't call it vengeance, he claimed the city's patron god Marduk had abandoned it, making its destruction a sacred duty. Yet for all its brutality, this religion had a paradoxical fragility. The same gods who justified expansion offered no comfort in defeat. When Nineveh fell, chroniclers of rival kingdoms gleefully wrote that Ashur's statues were smashed, his temples defiled, as if the empire's collapse proved its gods were never truly omnipotent. In the end, Assyria's deities became a cautionary tale. When gods are fashioned in the image of conquest, their fate is tied to the sword, and swords, no matter how sharp, eventually break. Behind the towering statues of Assyrian kings and the thunder of their armies, another force quietly shaped the empire, its women. While history books often paint Assyria as a hyper-masculine war machine, the truth is far more nuanced. Take Queen Sammu-rammat, better known by her Greek name Semiramis, who didn't just stand beside the throne, she ruled in her own right during the 9th century BCE. Ancient inscriptions describe her leading military campaigns, overseeing construction projects, and even founding new cities. This wasn't some anomaly. It was proof that even in a society built on conquest, women could ascend to the highest echelons of power. But queens weren't the only women wielding influence. Assyrian priestesses held sway in temples that doubled as political hubs, interpreting omens that could make or break a king's decisions. The high priestess of Ishtar, for example, wasn't just a ceremonial figure. She controlled vast estates, managed trade networks, and even advised generals on when to launch campaigns based on celestial signs. Clay tablets reveal how kings sought her blessings before battle, treating her words with the same weight as their top military advisors. Even among the elite, women navigated the empire's rigid hierarchy with startling agency. Legal records show noblewomen owning property, initiating divorces, and financing trade expeditions. One tablet from Nineveh details a widow named Hulia who successfully sued her brother-in-law for control of her late husband's textile business, a case she won not through manipulation, but by citing Assyrian contract law. These weren't exceptions, they were evidence of a system where women could leverage both tradition and bureaucracy to their advantage. Yet the most fascinating paradox lies in the royal harem's spaces, often misunderstood as mere prisons of luxury. In reality, Assyrian harems were power centers where favored wives and concubines formed alliances, brokered deals, and sometimes even orchestrated coups. Letters between King Esarhaddon and his mother Nakia reveal her orchestrating political marriages, negotiating with foreign envoys, and essentially acting as his chief diplomat. The harem wasn't just a king's pleasure quarters, it was a shadow court where women pulled strings that shaped empires. What makes these stories so compelling isn't just their existence, it's how they force us to rethink the Assyrian world. Yes, this was a society that glorified brute strength and battlefield dominance, but it was also one where a priestess's prophecy could halt an army, where a queen's signature carried the same weight as a general's, and where women didn't just witness history, they wrote it. The Assyrians may have built their empire on fear, but its foundations were far more complex than the battlefield alone. They understood that true power wasn't just about who held the sword, it was about who knew how to wield influence in the shadows. And in those shadows, women reigned supreme. The Assyrian legal system didn't just punish crimes, it weaponized justice as another form of control. Imagine a world where stealing a loaf of bread could cost you a hand, where whispering against the king meant having your tongue torn out, where even minor offenses carried penalties so brutal they etched themselves into public memory. This wasn't just law enforcement, it was theater designed to make every citizen feel the empire's grip tightening around their daily lives. The message was clear: step out of line, and the consequences would be written not in fines or prison sentences, but in blood and scars. Take the famous Middle Assyrian laws carved into clay tablets around 1100 BCE. These weren't vague guidelines, they were meticulous, almost surgical in their precision. Adultery, death for both parties, often by impalement. Theft, depending on the value of the stolen goods, you might lose fingers, ears, or even your nose. False accusations, the liar would suffer whatever punishment their innocent target would have faced. But here's what made these laws truly terrifying: their consistency. Unlike other ancient codes that allowed for exceptions or bribes, Assyrian justice applied to nearly everyone, from lowly farmers to wealthy merchants. The empire understood that fear only works if it's unpredictable in its severity but absolute in its inevitability. Yet the legal system's real genius lay in its psychological reach. Punishments weren't carried out behind closed doors, they were public spectacles. A thief's severed hand might be nailed to the city gates. A rebel's flayed skin could hang in the marketplace for weeks. These weren't just sentences, they were living advertisements for the cost of disobedience. Even the language of legal decrees dripped with menace. One surviving verdict reads, "Let his eyes be gouged out, let his ears be cut off, and let his corpse be fed to the dogs, that all may see and tremble." The goal wasn't just to punish one person, it was to sear the lesson into the minds of thousands. But the system had a twisted kind of fairness. Assyrian laws also protected the vulnerable in ways that would seem progressive by ancient standards. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and even demand punishment for abusive husbands provided they navigated the system carefully. Contracts were binding, debts were recorded, and merchants who cheated customers faced brutal penalties. This duality was deliberate. By mixing extreme cruelty with pockets of order, the empire created a perverse sense of stability. Citizens might live in terror of the law, but they also knew exactly where its lines were drawn. What's chilling is how modern this all feels. The Assyrians grasped something many societies still struggle with. That effective control isn't just about force, it's about perception. Their laws didn't just deter crime, they reshaped behavior by making people police themselves. Why risk stealing when the price was carved into the mutilated bodies displayed in every town square? Why plot rebellion when even a rumor of disloyalty could bring the executioner's blade? The legal code became an invisible chain, one that tightened not around wrists but around minds. And perhaps that's the most unsettling legacy of Assyrian justice. Long after their armies faded and their cities crumbled, their approach to law and order endured. From Hammurabi's code to modern authoritarian regimes, the shadow of their system lingers, a reminder that fear, when codified and weaponized, can be the most durable empire of all. Assyrian art doesn't just depict history, it weaponizes it. Walk through the ruins of an Assyrian palace, and you're not just seeing decorations, you're stepping into a carefully crafted nightmare designed to paralyze the will to resist. Their reliefs and sculptures are a paradox of breathtaking skill and calculated terror, where every chisel mark serves a dual purpose: to awe and to intimidate. Take the famous lion hunt scenes from Ashurbanipal's palace. At first glance, they're masterpieces of motion and detail, the king's muscles taut as he drives a spear into a roaring beast. But look closer, the lions aren't just animals, they're stand-ins for Assyria's enemies, powerful, defiant, and ultimately doomed. The message is unmistakable. If this is what we do to lions, imagine what awaits you. What sets Assyrian art apart isn't just its violence, but its storytelling precision. Unlike Egyptian art, which often froze pharaohs in static glory, Assyrian carvings are cinematic. Scenes unfold in sequences like panels from a graphic novel, armies scaling walls, prisoners dragged by hooks through their jaws, kings receiving tribute from groveling rulers. The artists didn't shy from gore, arrows protrude from wounds, blood sprays in arcs, severed heads pile like fruit. Yet there's a chilling order to it all. Chaos is rendered with geometric precision, as if to say even slaughter follows Assyrian rules. The true genius lies in the audience. These artworks weren't hidden away, they lined throne rooms and gateways where foreign envoys would see them. Diplomats from rival kingdoms, forced to wait beneath carvings of their own people's defeat, got a preview of what resistance might bring. Even the materials spoke volumes. Colossal winged bulls or lamashu guarding palace entrances weren't just statues. They were optical illusions. Carved with 5 legs, they appeared immovable from the front but mid-stride from the side. A metaphor for an empire that could seem omnipresent yet strike without warning. Yet for all its brutality, Assyrian art pulses with life. Animals are rendered with astonishing realism, gazelles mid-leap, horses' flared nostrils, the ripple of muscles under fur. This wasn't just technical skill, it was psychological warfare. By contrasting vibrant, lifelike creatures with scenes of human suffering, the artists underscored a dark truth. In the Assyrian world, only the obedient thrived. Nature flourished, rebels became part of the landscape. Perhaps the most telling detail is what's missing. Nowhere do these reliefs show Assyrian losses or pain. Every arrow finds its mark, every enemy falls, every king stands triumphant. This wasn't art as record-keeping. It was art as destiny, and for centuries it worked. The mere rumor of Assyria's approach could topple kingdoms because their art had already painted the ending. The stones themselves whispered, surrender or become just another scene on the wall. The Assyrian Chariot wasn't just a vehicle, it was a revolution on wheels, a rolling terror that redefined ancient warfare. Picture a lightweight, swift machine built not for ceremony but for carnage, its wheels reinforced with iron to plow through mud and blood alike. Unlike the cumbersome chariots of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Assyrian designs were stripped down for speed and maneuverability. A single chariot could carry 3 warriors, a driver steering with lethal precision, an archer loosing arrows at a relentless pace, and a shield-bearer deflecting incoming attacks. This wasn't transportation, it was a mobile killing platform, the ancient world's closest equivalent to a tank. What made these chariots truly devastating was how they were deployed. Assyrian tacticians didn't just send them charging blindly, they coordinated chariot units like a conductor leading an orchestra. One group would smash enemy formations, creating chaos, while another circled to cut off retreat. Archers perched on the chariots could pick off targets with terrifying accuracy, their arrows raining down before opponents even had time to raise their shields. And when the moment was right, the chariots would pivot, their spearmen driving long lances into the fractured enemy lines. The psychological impact was just as calculated. The thunder of hooves, the dust clouds swirling around iron-rimmed wheels. Before the first clash, entire armies would already be on the brink of panic. But the genius lay in the details. Assyrian engineers constantly refined their designs, lowering the chariot's center of gravity to prevent tipping during sharp turns. They added leather straps for crew stability, allowing archers to fire accurately even at full speed. Some chariots even featured metal plates along the sides, turning them into moving fortresses. These weren't static weapons, they evolved with every campaign, adapting to new terrains and threats. the chariot's dominance wasn't just about technology, it was about integration. Assyrian armies combined chariots with infantry and cavalry in a way no one had before. Chariots would break enemy lines, creating gaps for foot soldiers to exploit, while horsemen chased down fleeing foes. This combined arms approach was centuries ahead of its time, a testament to the Assyrian understanding that true power came from synergy. Yet perhaps the chariot's most enduring legacy was its role as a symbol. Kings like Ashurbanipal II commissioned reliefs showing themselves standing triumphantly in chariots, their horses trampling enemies beneath them. These images weren't just art, they were propaganda, broadcasting the empire's might to friend and foe alike. The message was clear: resistance was as futile as standing before a charging chariot. And in that certainty, the Assyrians found their greatest weapon, not just the chariot itself, but the unshakable dread it carried into every battle. Assyrian diplomacy didn't involve delicate negotiations or honeyed words. It began and ended with a simple choice: surrender or be erased. Their envoys weren't smooth-talking ambassadors. They were human thunderbolts, delivering messages etched in iron. Imagine a foreign king receiving an Assyrian delegation, not with gifts of gold, but with a clay tablet inscribed with chilling precision. Bow before my majesty, or your cities will become ash, your fields salt, and your people food for vultures. These weren't idle threats. Every word was backed by centuries of proven brutality, a track record so consistent that most rulers didn't dare call the bluff. The genius of this approach lay in its efficiency. Why waste resources besieging a city when its leaders could be terrified into submission before the first arrow was knocked? Take the case of King Ahaz of Judah, who, upon hearing of Assyria's approach, didn't even muster his army. He emptied his treasury instead, sending silver, gold, and even the doors of his own temple to Nineveh as tribute. The Assyrians didn't just demand wealth, they demanded humiliation, forcing rulers to publicly acknowledge their inferiority. Tribute lists were meticulous, itemizing everything from exotic animals to the daughters of noble families, taken as hostages to ensure compliance. But the real psychological masterstroke was how they tailored their threats. To desert tribes, they promised to fill oases with corpses. To coastal cities, they vowed to pile bodies so high the sea would turn red. Each warning was customized to exploit the deepest fears of its audience. And when envoys spoke, they didn't just describe consequences, they enacted them. Survivors from sacked cities were sometimes paraded alongside diplomats, their scars and missing limbs serving as living proof of Assyria's resolve. Yet beneath the terror lay a cold calculus. The Assyrians understood that a reputation for mercy could be as dangerous as weakness. When King Sargon II spared Babylon after its revolt, it only emboldened others to rebel. His son Sennacherib learned the lesson brutally, razing the city so thoroughly that later generations believed the Old Testament's claim that God himself had struck down his army for its arrogance. In truth, the real message was darker. Even gods couldn't protect you from Assyria. What's fascinating is how this diplomacy of dread backfired in the end. By the empire's twilight years, enemies had stopped surrendering altogether. Why pay tribute when annihilation was inevitable? The Babylonians, Medes, and others formed alliances not out of loyalty, but sheer desperation. Assyria's greatest weapon, fear, had finally met its match, a hatred so deep it united former rivals. Their diplomacy had conquered an empire, but in the process, it sowed the seeds of their own destruction. The lesson echoes through history: rule by terror alone, and one day, even the terrified will stop flinching. The lion hunt wasn't just a royal pastime, it was theater, a brutal performance where the stage was the desert and the stakes were nothing less than the divine right to rule. Kings like Ashurbanipal didn't chase lions for sport. They orchestrated spectacles so meticulously planned, they bordered on ritual. Picture the scene: captive lions, starved and agitated, released into an arena of sand and stone, while the king stood atop his chariot, bow drawn, surrounded by guards armed with nothing more than shields and spears. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a fair fight. It was a demonstration of absolute dominance, a living metaphor for how Assyria dealt with chaos by crushing it beneath the wheels of order. What made these hunts so effective as propaganda was their duality. On one level, they showcased the king's physical prowess, his skill with a bow, his courage in the face of raging beasts. But on another, deeper level, they framed him as the empire's divine protector. Lions weren't just animals in Assyrian symbolism. They embodied the untamed forces of nature, the enemies at the gates, the chaos that threatened civilization itself. When Ashurbanipal drove his spear into a lion's heart, he wasn't just killing a beast, he was enacting a cosmic drama, proving his ability to shield his people from the world's darkness. The staging of these events was just as calculated as their symbolism. Reliefs from Ashurbanipal's palace show lions released from cages in sequence, ensuring a steady stream of targets. Archers stood ready to wound but not kill, leaving the final blow for the king. Even the lions' suffering was part of the narrative, their agonized roars, their desperate charges, all underscoring the inevitability of their defeat. These hunts weren't spontaneous. They were scripted down to the last arrow, designed to erase any doubt about the king's invincibility. But the true genius lay in the audience. These spectacles weren't private affairs. Nobles, foreign dignitaries, and even commoners were invited to witness them, their gasps and cheers amplifying the king's legend. Afterward, artists would carve every detail into palace walls: the king's poised stance, the lion's snarls frozen in stone, so those who hadn't seen the hunt in person would still feel its weight. The message seeped into the cultural bloodstream. If the king could master nature's fiercest creatures, what chance did mere rebels stand? Yet there's a haunting irony to these displays. The same kings who staged these hunts as proof of their strength were often far removed from actual battlefields. Ashurbanipal, for all his lion-slaying bravado, rarely led troops in person. The hunts were a carefully crafted illusion, a substitute for the front lines where real blood was spilled. In the end, they revealed a deeper truth about Assyrian power. It wasn't just built on strength, but on the appearance of strength. And in that distinction lay the empire's greatest vulnerability, because illusions, no matter how vivid, can only last as long as people choose to believe in them. Beneath the Assyrian Empire's reputation for brutality lay an unexpected sophistication: their mastery of medicine. While their armies were notorious for inflicting wounds, their physicians were equally skilled at repairing them. Clay tablets from Nineveh's royal library reveal surgical procedures so precise they wouldn't be matched for centuries. One text details how to drain pus from abscesses with bronze lancets. Another describes setting broken bones with splints made of leather and wood. But what's truly startling is their understanding of antiseptics. They cleaned wounds with alcohol and honey, substances we now know have natural antibacterial properties. This wasn't just trial and error. It was systematized knowledge recorded in cuneiform with the same meticulous care as military campaigns. The driving force behind these advances wasn't compassion, it was cold pragmatism. Every healed soldier was another blade for the war machine. Medical texts prioritized battlefield injuries, arrow extractions, spear wounds, even the psychological trauma of combat. One prescription for a soldier whose heart is troubled involved a potion of beer, myrrh, and crushed seeds, an ancient recognition of what we'd now call post-traumatic stress. The empire's focus was clear: repair and return to duty. Convalescent homes near barracks ensured wounded warriors could rejoin the ranks swiftly, while physicians traveled with armies, their toolkits stocked with opium for pain and alum to staunch bleeding. Yet their medicine wasn't limited to war. Assyrian doctors treated everything from tooth decay using a paste of crushed pumice and vinegar to digestive ailments with fermented milk rich in probiotics. Women's health had its own dedicated tablets with remedies for childbirth complications and menstrual pain, but even these civilian treatments served the empire's goals. Healthy farmers meant steady food supplies for armies. Thriving artisans produced weapons and armor. The line between clinic and barracks blurred completely in texts that classified patients by their usefulness. A smith with fever, treat urgently. A slave with fever, observe 3 days. The paradox of Assyrian medicine lies in its duality. The same hands that stitched wounds also flayed prisoners alive. The empire that pioneered early tracheotomies invented execution by forced swallowing of hot metal. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was hierarchy. Healing was reserved for those who strengthened the state, for enemies only suffering. Their medical texts, like their war reliefs, were ultimately tools of control. By keeping the machinery of empire human and metal in working order, Assyrian physicians proved that even healing could be a form of conquest. The Assyrians didn't just rely on brute force to maintain their empire. They built one of history's first sophisticated spy networks, turning information into a weapon as deadly as any sword. While other ancient powers waited for rebellions to erupt, the Assyrians smothered them in the cradle, thanks to an army of informants who infiltrated every level of society. These weren't just random snitches, they were meticulously placed assets, from disgruntled servants in noble households to merchants traveling between cities, their ears always open for whispers of dissent. The empire's survival depended on knowing its enemies' plans before they did, and their methods were as ruthless as they were effective. Consider the case of Babylon's attempted revolt in 700 BCE. Before the rebels could even sharpen their swords, Assyrian agents had already intercepted their messages, identified their leaders, and delivered the names to King Sennacherib's court. The response was swift, and brutal ringleaders were impaled along the city's main road, while their families vanished into the empire's vast network of labor camps. But what's chilling isn't just the punishment, it's the precision of the intelligence that enabled it. Assyrian spies didn't just report rumors, they verified them, cross-referencing accounts from multiple sources to separate truth from paranoia. Clay tablets from Nineveh's archives revealed detailed dossiers on suspected traitors, listing their allies, movements, and even personal grudges that could be exploited. The real innovation, though, was how they institutionalized espionage. Unlike ad hoc informants used by other ancient states, the Assyrians created a formal intelligence apparatus. Provincial governors were required to send monthly reports to the capital, documenting everything from crop yields to tavern gossip. Military scouts doubled as spies, mapping enemy territories while noting which villages might harbor sympathizers. Even diplomats played dual roles, their lavish gifts and flattery masking careful probes for weakness. This wasn't just a network, it was a system designed to funnel every scrap of knowledge back to the king's inner circle. But the most unsettling tactic was their use of psychological manipulation. Assyrian spies didn't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they wanted to be seen. A merchant caught whispering to a rebel might suddenly escape custody, spreading panic that the empire knew everything. A scribe might accidentally leave behind a tablet listing conspirators' names, only for it to be discovered by the very people it implicated. The goal wasn't just to uncover plots, but to paralyze would-be rebels with the gnawing fear that their neighbors, even their own families, might be informants. In this climate, trust became a liability and silence the only survival strategy. What's remarkable is how little the Assyrians distinguished between military and civilian intelligence. A drought in a far-off province wasn't just a logistical concern. It was a potential spark for revolt, requiring preemptive grain shipments or, if necessary, a garrison deployment. Even temple priests were monitored, their prophecies scrutinized for coded messages. Nothing was too trivial to escape the empire's gaze, because the Assyrians understood a fundamental truth. Power isn't just about controlling land, it's about controlling the flow of information. And in that dark art, they were centuries ahead of their time. Their legacy lingers in modern intelligence practices, from the use of double agents to the analysis of patterns in seemingly mundane data. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is the one that ultimately spelled their downfall. A system built on pervasive distrust can stifle rebellion, but it can also suffocate loyalty. When the Babylonians and Medes finally turned on Assyria, no network of spies could save them, because fear, for all its power, can never truly replace allegiance. The Assyrian Empire didn't just run on conquest, it ran on commerce, with trade routes stretching farther than their armies ever marched. While the spoils of war filled their coffers with gold and silver, it was the steady flow of luxury goods that turned their cities into glittering hubs of wealth and power. Ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, these weren't just symbols of status, they were the lifeblood of an economy designed to fuel endless expansion. Every caravan that rolled into Nineveh or Ashur carried more than spices and silks. It carried the empire's ability to project dominance far beyond the reach of its swords. But here's the twist: the Assyrians didn't just passively receive these goods, they weaponized trade, controlling critical routes with the same ruthlessness they applied to battlefields. Take the Euphrates River, the ancient world's equivalent of a superhighway. Assyrian forts loomed over every major crossing, their garrisons demanding tolls from merchants while spies mingled with traders, extracting intelligence under the guise of casual conversation. Cities that resisted paying tariffs found their access abruptly cut off, their economies strangled until local rulers had no choice but to kneel. This wasn't just business, it was coercion disguised as commerce, a way to bend rivals to their will without drawing a blade. The real genius, though, lay in how they turned loot into leverage. Tribute from conquered lands wasn't hoarded in vaults, it was reinvested into infrastructure that made the empire richer. Roads paved with crushed stone allowed armies and merchants to move faster than ever before. Waystations stocked with fresh horses and supplies meant caravans could traverse the empire in weeks instead of months. Even their infamous deportations served an economic purpose. Skilled artisans from captured cities were resettled near raw materials, creating hubs of production where none existed before. A glassblower from Phoenicia might find himself crafting goblets in Assyria's heartland, his work sold back to his homeland at a staggering profit. Yet the most potent trade good of all was fear itself. Assyrian merchants didn't just sell wares, they sold stories, spreading tales of the empire's might to every marketplace from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. A merchant hawking Assyrian textiles in Damascus might casually mention the fate of a rebellious city, ensuring the message traveled farther than any herald could carry it. The result: kingdoms on the empire's fringes often submitted without a fight, offering favorable trade terms just to avoid becoming the next cautionary tale. This system had a dark irony, though. The wealth that built Nineveh's towering palaces also made it a target. When the empire finally fell, its conquerors didn't just destroy its armies, they plundered its trade networks, redirecting the flow of gold and goods to their own capitals. The Assyrians had proven that commerce could conquer as surely as cavalry, but in the end, their greatest weapon became their most vulnerable point, because an economy built on domination, no matter how sophisticated, will always create enemies hungry to tear it down. The echoes of Assyrian warfare reverberate through modern military academies, where strategists still dissect their campaigns not as ancient history, but as masterclasses in psychological dominance and tactical innovation. Consider the infamous shock and awe doctrine of modern warfare, the overwhelming display of force designed to paralyze an enemy's will to fight. This isn't some 21st century invention. It's a page torn straight from the Assyrian playbook. When coalition forces in the Gulf War used precision airstrikes to cripple Iraqi communications before ground troops advanced, they were employing the same core principle Assyrian kings understood millennia ago: break the mind before engaging the body. Siege warfare today still bears the fingerprints of Assyrian engineering. Their multi-layered approach, combining sappers, siege towers, and psychological pressure, mirrors modern urban combat strategies. The Israeli Defense Forces' meticulous clearing of fortified positions in Gaza, or the Russian encirclement tactics in Ukraine, all trace their lineage back to those ancient battle plans carved on Nineveh's walls. Even the concept of hearts and minds campaigns has roots in Assyrian methods, though where modern armies might build schools to win over populations, the Assyrians used calculated brutality to ensure compliance. The tools have changed, but the underlying calculus of control remains startlingly similar. Perhaps their most enduring legacy lies in information warfare. Assyrian kings didn't just win battles, they controlled the narrative, commissioning reliefs that depicted their enemies not as honorable foes, but as groveling cowards. Fast forward to today's social media battlegrounds, where nations weaponize viral videos and deepfakes to demoralize opponents. The Islamic State's gruesome propaganda videos, meant to terrify enemies into submission, could have been lifted from Ashurbanipal's playbook. The medium has evolved from stone carvings to smartphones, but the goal remains identical: make resistance seem not just futile, but unimaginable. What makes the Assyrian approach so timeless is its brutal pragmatism. Their innovations weren't about honor or glory, they were about results. When U.S. forces in Iraq adopted the Anbar awakening strategy, paying former insurgents to switch sides, they were unknowingly replicating Assyria's system of rewarding defectors while punishing holdouts. Even the controversial use of drone strikes follows Assyrian logic. Why risk your own troops when you can eliminate threats remotely and let the survivors spread terror for you? Yet there's a cautionary tale in this legacy. The Assyrian Empire ultimately collapsed when its enemies united against it, their hatred outweighing their fear. Modern militaries studying these ancient strategies must grapple with the same question: can control built primarily on intimidation ever truly last? The ruins of Nineveh suggest an answer, whispering across 3,000 years that while fear can build empires, only something stronger can sustain them. The Assyrians may have written the first chapter in the manual of psychological warfare, but their own demise wrote the most important footnote: no amount of terror can compensate for the absence of legitimacy. The Assyrian Empire didn't just collapse, it vanished from memory, as if the world had collectively agreed to forget the nightmare it once represented. Unlike Egypt, whose pyramids kept its name alive in whispers for millennia, or Rome, whose roads and laws became the bedrock of Western civilization, Assyria's legacy was swallowed by the sands of time. Its grand cities Nineveh, Nimrud, Ashur were left to crumble, their towering walls reduced to wind-scattered mounds. Even their language, Akkadian, once the diplomatic tongue of empires, fell silent, replaced by Aramaic and later Greek. This wasn't just a fall from power, it was a cultural eclipse, deliberate and thorough. The erasure began with their enemies. When the Babylonians and Medes sacked Nineveh in 612 BC, they didn't just demolish buildings, they targeted memory itself. Statues of Assyrian kings were defaced, their inscriptions chiseled away. Libraries were burned, though ironically, the very clay tablets that recorded Assyrian boasts of dominance survived the flames, baked harder by the fire. The victors rewrote history, casting Assyria as a cautionary tale of divine retribution, a monstrous regime that got what it deserved. Hebrew prophets like Nahum gleefully penned its obituary, "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder." The message was clear. This empire wasn't just defeated, it was condemned. Yet nature played its part too. The Tigris River, once the lifeblood of Assyria, shifted its course over centuries, burying ruins under layers of silt. Wind and rain smoothed the edges of colossal Lamashu statues until they melted back into the earth. Even the location of Nineveh, a metropolis of over 100,000 people, faded into legend. By the time Greek historians like Herodotus wrote about Mesopotamia, Assyria was already a half-remembered name, conflated with Babylon or Persia. The empire became a ghost, its reality replaced by myth. Some medieval European maps even placed the biblical Tower of Babel in Nineveh's ruins, blurring fact and fiction. The irony is that this oblivion preserved Assyria better than any monument could have. Because their cities were abandoned, not rebuilt, archaeologists in the 19th century found them frozen in time. When Austin Henry Layard uncovered Nimrud in the 1840s, he stumbled onto walls still lined with vivid reliefs, their colors miraculously intact. The Library of Ashurbanipal, though burned, left behind 30,000 fire-hardened tablets, a trove of knowledge waiting millennia to be read. In death, Assyria achieved what it never could in life: immortality. What's haunting is how thoroughly an empire can disappear when the world wants it gone. Rome's legacy was curated by admirers, Egypt's was romanticized by poets. But Assyria, its name became shorthand for cruelty, its achievements buried under its reputation. Only when scholars deciphered cuneiform in the 19th century did the truth re-emerge. This wasn't just a kingdom of savagery, but of innovation, artistry, and staggering complexity. The very forces that erased Assyria also saved it, leaving its story not in the hands of descendants, but in the dirt, waiting for a future that might finally see it clearly. The shadow of Assyria lingers in our stories, myths, and screens, though few realize the blood-stained history behind these fleeting glimpses. Take the Bible's book of Jonah, where the prophet is sent to Nineveh, that great city of blood. Modern readers often picture a generic ancient metropolis, but the original audience would have shuddered at the name. Nineveh wasn't just any city. It was the beating heart of an empire that had tormented the Israelites for generations. The story's tension hinges on this unspoken truth. Jonah wasn't walking into a spiritual mission. He was stepping into the lion's den of human history's most terrifying superpower. Video games like Assassin's Creed Origins and Total War resurrect Assyria's war machine with startling accuracy, letting players command chariot divisions or besiege cities with towering battering rams. Yet these depictions often miss the psychological horror that defined real Assyrian warfare. When a total war general accepts an enemy's surrender, it's a diplomacy mechanic, but in reality, surrender was just the beginning of Assyrian punishment. Hollywood does no better. The 1956 film The Ten Commandments includes a fleeting shot of Assyrian cavalry, their pointed helmets and scaled armor meticulously researched, but reduces them to exotic set dressing. Their true legacy, the calculated terror, the mass deportations, the skinning of rebels gets lost in the spectacle. Even our language carries echoes of their brutality. The phrase blood and iron, later associated with Prussian militarism, Assyria perfected it first, forging weapons and spilling blood with equal precision. The concept of shock and awe, touted in modern warfare manuals, Assyrian generals wrote the original playbook using burning villages and impaled corpses to paralyze enemies before battle. Yet these connections remain invisible, their origins buried under centuries of retelling. The most telling gap lies in what pop culture doesn't borrow. Where are the stories about Ashurbanipal's library, a beacon of knowledge built by hands that also flayed prisoners? Where's the epic about Semiramis, the warrior queen who defied expectations in a hyper-masculine empire? Assyria's complexity gets sanded down into a caricature of mindless violence, when the truth was far more unsettling. Their brilliance and barbarity were two sides of the same coin. Perhaps this selective memory serves a purpose. The Assyrians force us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that civilization's march forward often tramples over bodies. So we relegate them to biblical footnotes and game levels, keeping their full horror at arm's length. But the fragments that slip through, a menacing Lamashu statue in Indiana Jones, a passing reference in a history podcast, are like cracks in a dam. Behind them waits the flood of a reality too potent to fade entirely, an empire that mastered fear so thoroughly, its whispers still unsettle us 3,000 years later. Some historians suggest the Assyrians' fearsome reputation might be overblown, an ancient version of propaganda designed to intimidate, but the truth is written in stone, quite literally. The walls of their palaces aren't decorated with scenes of harvest festivals or trade agreements. They're carved with images of flayed prisoners, burning cities, and pyramids of severed heads, all commissioned by the kings themselves. This wasn't exaggeration, it was branding. When Ashurnasirpal II inscribed, "I flayed the nobles as one would flay a sheep and draped their skins over the city walls," he wasn't spinning a tale. Archaeologists have found mass graves near Nimrud matching these descriptions, skeletons stacked with the precision of an industrial slaughterhouse. What's chilling isn't just the violence, it's the bureaucratic pride they took in documenting it. Clay tablets from Nineveh's archives read like gruesome accounting ledgers. 16,000 enemy combatants executed, 700 tons of grain seized. 2,000 rebel leaders impaled along the royal highway. These weren't offhand boasts, they were meticulous records, tallied and archived alongside tax receipts and crop yields. The Assyrians didn't just commit atrocities, they audited them. Even their mercy was a form of cruelty. Survivors of defeated cities often describe being spared, only to be forced to march past the mutilated corpses of their neighbors before deportation. One Babylonian chronicle recounts prisoners being made to grind the bones of their own dead into mortar for Assyrian buildings. This wasn't random savagery, it was psychological engineering designed to break the will to resist for generations. The myth that their brutality was exaggerated often stems from a modern bias, the assumption that no society could function under such relentless terror. But Assyria thrived for centuries precisely because it weaponized fear so effectively. Their cruelty wasn't a flaw, it was their operating system. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Lachish, they didn't find evidence of embellishment. They found layers of ash, arrowheads embedded in defensive walls, and reliefs in Sennacherib's palace depicting the siege in horrifying detail. right down to the Judean prisoners being flayed alive. The uncomfortable truth is this: the Assyrians weren't just brutal by ancient standards, they industrialized brutality, turning it into a scalable system of control. Their records leave no ambiguity. They wanted the world to remember their ruthlessness not as a rumor, but as a certainty carved in stone and flesh. And in that, they succeeded far beyond their darkest intentions. The Assyrian Empire's rise and fall isn't just ancient history. It's a cautionary tale etched in blood and stone, a masterclass in the limits of raw power. For centuries, they ruled through a simple equation: terror plus efficiency equals control. But their eventual collapse reveals a truth as old as civilization itself. Fear might build empires, but it can't sustain them. Think of it like a pyramid built upside down. The wider their dominion grew, the more precarious it became, until even the slightest tremor could send it all crashing down. And the tremor came not from some unstoppable external force, but from the very people they'd spent generations intimidating into submission. Consider how Assyria's downfall mirrored its methods. The Babylonians and Medes didn't just defeat them militarily, they weaponized the empire's own tactics against them. When Nineveh fell, its conquerors didn't just sack the city, they erased it with the same thoroughness Assyrian kings had once reserved for their enemies. The mutilated statues, the burned libraries, the deliberate scattering of survivors, these weren't just acts of vengeance. They were a calculated reversal of Assyria's playbook, proving that no empire, no matter how terrifying, is immune to the consequences of its own brutality. What's haunting is how modern this all feels. From corporate empires to political regimes, the same patterns repeat. Leaders who mistake fear for loyalty, who confuse domination with stability, inevitably face the same reckoning. The Assyrians showed us that terror can suppress rebellion, but it can't foster the one thing that truly endures: legitimacy. A society held together by threats is like a dam built of sand. It might hold for a while, but eventually the pressure becomes too much. Yet there's a twist in this story. The Assyrians' greatest weakness wasn't their cruelty. It was their inability to imagine a world where cruelty wasn't enough. They never developed systems to inspire loyalty, only mechanisms to punish dissent. When crisis came, their subjects didn't rally to defend the empire. They seized the first chance to tear it apart. That's the lesson etched into Nineveh's ruins. Power sustained by fear alone is power living on borrowed time. Modern leaders would do well to study those ruins. In an age where information spreads faster than ever, where public trust is both currency and shield, the Assyrian model isn't just outdated, it's suicidal. You can force obedience, but you can't command respect. You can silence opposition, but you can't manufacture devotion. The empires that endure, whether political or cultural, understand this fundamental truth. Fear might win battles, but only something deeper: justice, vision, shared purpose, can win the war for longevity. The Assyrians left us more than just tales of terror. They left a mirror, one that reflects the fragility of power built on nothing but the willingness to inflict suffering. Their ruins whisper a warning across 3,000 years. No empire is invincible, and those who rule through fear alone will eventually meet the very fate they spent centuries doling out to others. The Assyrians didn't just build an empire, they engineered a nightmare so potent. Its shadow still darkens the pages of history. What makes them truly terrifying isn't the battles they won or the cities they burned, but the chilling precision with which they weaponized every aspect of human psychology. They didn't just conquer land, they colonized fear itself, turning it into a renewable resource that fueled their reign for centuries. And while their empire crumbled to dust long ago, the echoes of their methods ripple through modern warfare, governance, and even media. Think of the last time you heard a news story about a dictator's brutal crackdown or a military's calculated display of overwhelming force. These aren't new tactics. They're chapters from a playbook written in blood 2,800 years ago. But here's what sets the Assyrians apart: their genius for turning horror into bureaucracy. Their atrocities weren't frenzied acts of rage, they were cold, administrative procedures. Skinning rebels wasn't just punishment, it was policy. Mass deportations weren't chaos, they were logistics. Even their propaganda was systematized, with artists and scribes working side by side to craft narratives of invincibility. This marriage of creativity and cruelty is what makes them so unnervingly modern. In an age where social media algorithms and viral content shape perceptions, the Assyrians would have been masters of the digital landscape, leveraging every tool to amplify their message of absolute dominance. Yet their story isn't just a cautionary tale about power, it's a mirror. The same instincts that drove Assyrian kings to carve their triumphs into stone drive modern leaders to flood airwaves with carefully curated images of strength. The difference: we have the benefit of hindsight. The ruins of Nineveh aren't just archaeological sites, they're gravestones for an empire that mistook fear for loyalty, control for stability. They remind us that no system built solely on intimidation can outlast the collective will of those it oppresses. So the next time you scroll past a headline about psychological warfare, or watch a film where the villain rules through terror, remember, those tropes weren't invented in Hollywood. They were perfected in the dust and blood of ancient Mesopotamia. The Assyrians may have vanished from the earth, but their legacy lingers not just in history books, but in the uncomfortable truths they expose about the nature of power. And if that sends a shiver down your spine, well, that's exactly what they would have wanted. If this deep dive into history's most ruthless empire left you stunned, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold stories, and let us know in the comments, what ancient civilization should we unravel next?